session is very much focusing This session is very much focused on levelling up skills and employment. What we know is that participation has fallen over the last decade, and there's some significant gaps around particular groups of people and particular geographical areas. And the UK still lags behind many other countries on skills, which holds back both prosperity and fairness. So in this session, we're going to explore what we need to do to level up skills and opportunity for economic growth and social justice. We have three fantastic contributors, and I have some questions for them, and then we'd like to have questions from yourselves, so please do drop those in the chat. So I would like to welcome Erica Roscoe, who's Senior Research Fellow for IPPR North, David Hughes, Chief Executive of the Association of Colleges, and David Gallagher, Chief Executive of NCFE. And I'm going to start asking each of you to address one question, and then I have some others for you, and hopefully we'll have some questions from delegates too. So Erica, could I come to you first, just to ask you to explain to us some of the trends in adult participation in skills and training that we've seen in recent years?
Sure, thanks Fiona, and hi everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. So just in terms of the trends in adult participation in skills and training over the past years, we've seen quite a worrying trend, as you mentioned, in a gradual but consistent decrease in adult learning. A survey by the Learning and Work Institute indicates that we saw a shift from 41% of people who were currently studying or had taken part in learning in the last 3 years in 2015, down to just 33% in 2019. And sort of similar figures are borne out in other data sets as well. The only area where we've not seen this decrease is in skills level at level 4+, which is the sort of higher end of qualifications, where we've seen a slight but steady increase throughout the period. And just kind of thinking about, you know, from 2019 and onward from that into the pandemic, we've seen this a bit of a shake-up throughout the pandemic. And we've seen this quite a huge uplift in adult learning over the last sort of 15 months or so. And again, from the same figures, we've seen an increase from 33% in 2019 up to 43% in 2020. Which, you know, on the face of it, I think that's really positive. We've seen a great jump. But I think when you start to scratch the surface, you see that it's quite a complex picture in people who have taken up that learning over the last year. And we can see that we've not seen equal engagement across different groups. So learners have been more likely to be younger, they've been more likely to be employed full-time and not furloughed, they've been more likely to be of a higher social grade, and they're learning online. And again, similar to what we were seeing before the pandemic, we're seeing a greater increase in that level 4+ stage. And this all suggests that the learning throughout the pandemic has really been undertaken by those who've had the luxury to be able to, whereas those who are most affected by the impacts of the pandemic have not been able to take those opportunities. So people in less secure work, people who couldn't work from home, and those who were digitally excluded have all been less likely to undertake learning. Stop there.
Great, thank you. David Hughes, if I can come to you. So we've talked about adult participation in learning, but we also need to think about provision, what's on offer for them. Can you talk to us about the role of colleges in improving access and how the pandemic has affected delivery?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think it's a bit mixed, really. You know, colleges, I think, have done an amazing job to move things online really quickly. And where that works, it's worked pretty well generally. And Ofsted came in last year to do a sort of a review of that and found lots of good practice and things that could be improved. But what we've got to recognise is that for lots of adults, the sorts of things they're doing just can't be done virtually. You know, practical skills. I always think the best example is probably arboriculture. You know, so teaching someone how to use a chainsaw online probably isn't a very good way to make sure there's health and safety up a tree, you know. So So there are lots of examples like that where the hand skills and the health and safety and the ability to do the job is what you're learning in college, and you just can't do that virtually. So lots of people have missed out on that. Equally, there's lots of people doing things like ESOL, literacy, numeracy, where it's quite difficult for many of those learners to have the confidence to be able to do stuff online. Sometimes they haven't got the digital skills to do things online. And then just quite simply, there's a whole group of learners who don't have digital devices, don't have internet access or broadband, don't have a space to learn in. And actually, sometimes college is the sanctuary, you know. So there's I think there's lots of learners who've missed out. I think there's lots of people who don't believe they've got transferable skills as well, who might have been made redundant out of one sector, or who might get made redundant now, and who just don't feel like they can go and look for working in another area. And I don't think there's the advice around for that kind of transfer. And then I think there are some kind of quite profound barriers as well. I mean, the funding is bewildering. You know, there's just so much of it. If you look at things like there's the Towns Fund, the Levelling Up Fund, the Community Ownership Fund, the Community Renewal Fund, all physical infrastructure, none about people. Then for people, you've got boot camps, traineeships, apprenticeships, Kickstart, Restart, adult education budget. You know, it's bewildering really, and trying to pull all of that together at local level, I think is really, really tough. You know, Kickstart is 25 hours a week, but there's no training element on it. You know, why not? And trying to get the Job Centre Plus working with the college, with the employers, with the independent providers is really difficult. It's working in some areas, but it's not working in enough. So I think government needs to do more to join up policy funding programs, allow more flexibility at local level. And at local level, we need more people, more organisations to come together to plan what they're going to offer to employers, to make it simpler, make it more coherent, make it more joined up. And the final thing, I know Mims Davis this morning talked about universal credit claimants being able to do some training whilst they're claiming. That's fantastic, but it's still quite restricted to boot camps, I think, mainly, and 12 to 16 weeks. We just think more universal credit claimants need proper training to get the skills they need to get good, meaningful, long-term, secure jobs.
Thank you, David. Coming to you, David Gallagher. The whole premise of the kind of levelling up agenda is that things are unequal to start qualities. What does that look like from your perspective, and what do we need to prioritise if we are going to level up?
Sorry, Fiona, I missed the middle bit of the question, so hopefully I've got all of that just broke there, but just correct me if I miss anything. So for me, there's some really key ingredients at a systems level that we need to think about long and hard and be acting on sooner rather than later. Within the tertiary education system, and specifically within vocational and technical, we've become obsessed with employer centricity. And we've become obsessed with vocational and technical, very hard vocational and technical skills being the solution to lots of things. It's wrong. We've got to think about the needs of learners, the needs of communities, the very varied and nuanced experiences that lots of individuals have had over this period that have really shifted the profile of where people are at in terms of their learning journey, and ultimately their outcomes and their progression opportunities. So we've got to develop a much deeper understanding of the needs of learners and the communities that that reside within, and society more broadly, and balance that with the needs of employers. Because if we just look at what employers want and need, we'll miss the point that actually, have we got, you know, the knowledge, the skills, the resilience, the adaptability in our young people in particular, but of course we know this sector is much broader than just young people, to be ready to take an active part in society and the economy and labour market. So I think that for me is, at a systems level, we've got to get that better balance between the needs of learners, communities and societies, balanced with the needs of the economy and the labour market. And then also to the point on vocational and technical skills, we all know now, and I find myself saying this in almost at every opportunity, the world, the labour market, the economy, the labour market, and the skills need of the labour market in future, the pace of change is only increasing. It's unabating, it's increasing. And if we remain obsessed with, you know, designing and developing programs that take a couple of years to come to market, then another year or two for a learner to turn out the other end of a program, to be, you know, in the labour market, you productively utilising that skill, it's just not quick enough for how the world is moving. And technical skills, vocational skills keep on changing at a pace that is frightening, really. So to my mind, we've got to put at the centre of most areas of curriculum what I describe as meta skills. You know, David often talks about enrichment activities. Do you know, what are the things that are going to give people the skills and the I suppose the behavioural characteristics, really, to be ready for whatever the world throws at them, you know, to be ready for this really volatile, unpredictable and dynamically changing world that we're in. So they are the two things that, for me, that I think we've got to take from this really intensive period of work through the pandemic and seeing how rapidly the world has shifted in so many ways, how many sectors have changed rapidly, job roles, skills needs have changed, and how do we make sure we understand the needs of learners and make sure that we put right at the centre of our provision the things that are going to equip them for whatever happens in terms of, you know, big changes in the world.
Thanks, David. I mean, it seems to me that skills policy is therefore really important in levelling up, but it's not sufficient. You talk about connecting. We had inputs this morning, both from an employment side and a skills side. We need to make those connections across a whole range of policy agendas and have that really strong policy working. Erica, what, from your perspective, does future policy need to focus on, and how does it need to be connected to ensure that we get levelling up right and get it beyond the kind of phrase that we all throw out to something that actually feels and is different?
I think that there are sort of 4 points for me around future policy to make sure that the skills can, you know, there's a huge opportunity here for skills to really support this levelling up agenda. So I think the first point is that we need to recognise the value of all roles within our economy and within our society. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted that. This assumption that low paid equals low skilled, when roles like care work, for example, they really need to be recognised for what they are. They're demanding, they're highly skilled, they're undervalued, and we need to level up these roles in the eyes of policymakers, employers and educators to encourage and attract more people to those roles. I think secondly, there's a huge opportunity around the devolution of the responsibility for the adult education budget, which kind of builds on what David Gallagher was saying around, yes, I think that we need to look at the economy, but we also need to look at the needs of communities as well. The devolution of the adult education budget would enable, or does enable, metro mayors to identify the strengths of different regions, build on them, but taking a more bottom-up approach, so it's having a greater impact on communities. And I think that being able to link skills and training to demand among employers at that local level creates a better pathway for individuals to move from training to employment, making a more stable transition into the workforce. And then the last 2 points, again, touch on what the other two have said. Firstly, around technical skills, I think we do need to raise the profile of those technical skills and technical roles. But having said that, we shouldn't be kind of looking at those as the only answer. So in terms of levelling up, there's great potential here to look at green jobs and digital roles and other roles like that are by their nature quite highly technical. And they don't need to be based in London or the South East. They can be based, you know, across the country. And there's a huge opportunity for the North there. But as I said, that shouldn't be those technical roles shouldn't be the only way into work for people from more deprived areas. People should have the same choices available to them regardless of where they live. And we really need to be cautious that you know, this technical roles isn't the sort of be all and end all. Young people should be free to make their own choice about which route they take, whether it's into sort of more technical routes or more academic. And equally, I think all roles for people who are already in the workforce. All roles should, even those low skilled roles, should offer routes for progression for those who want it. And I think if we can achieve that, then that's a huge step forward for the levelling up agenda.
Great, thank you. David Hoops, we have a skills for jobs white paper with a whole set of policies in, and you listed lots of them. There is quite a focus on partnerships and collaboration there. Have we got, is the policy right? Will it lead to levelling up? Is it right or wrong, or just not enough?
So it's a very good question. I mean, I think you have to ask what levelling up means, don't you? I mean, we've sort of almost started at the wrong place. I mean, I think it's quite interesting to look at what the government have said about it, and particularly what the Prime Minister said recently. And I think the Prime Minister recently sort of felt to me like it sort of moved a bit in what levelling up was about, because a lot of what we've seen is the traditional sort of regeneration funding, where they build transport hubs, roads, you know, and think about buildings, which is not unimportant and it's probably necessary, but far from sufficient. I think where they've got to now is thinking much more closely about the economic change that's needed to create the jobs for which that then creates the skills demand. And I think it's really important to start there. You know, I'm with David definitely that this shouldn't be all about employment, but to really level up this country, we need more better jobs in places like where Erica works, you know, and like Midlands where I am, because there aren't enough, and there aren't enough employers thinking about how to develop their businesses to become higher productivity, higher value added, and so on. So part of the skills white paper that we really pushed for was thinking about how you get colleges to have the expertise to support SMEs to improve their businesses. You know, so innovation in this country has largely been about things like graphene and sexy, big, you know, new tech. Actually, what most SMEs need is kind of low tech, kind of proven innovation that they can adopt, which then creates a skills need, which then offers a fantastic new job for people, or an improved job, which needs a skills input. And because skills is a derived demand, isn't it, for adults? I mean, it's different for young people. And what Erica was saying about we shouldn't restrict young people by the local labour market is spot on. But for adults, a lot of them want to stay where they are. They've got responsibilities and families. What they need is an employer who will invest in their business and as well as the skills at the same time. And I don't think we've got that join up right. You know, I don't think Bayes is working with DFE to think about how those things to come together, as well as DWP, about what a good job looks like and how you get people not just cycling and recycling in and out of universal credit because they haven't got the skills to be able to stay in a job and progress in a job. So I think it's quite complex. And yet there are some places having a real go at this. And we need to learn from what they're doing and how they're doing it and what works and what the barriers are.
Great, thank you. David Gallagher, I'll come back to you. It is an important point, isn't it, that kind of we throw around the term levelling up without really unpicking it, about what it might mean and what we would need to do to make it happen. I think everybody's talked about the role of partnerships. I think I'm quite interested in your view of kind of what levelling up should be and who needs to be involved, and how do we make sure we have a system where we all work together in those partnerships to level up, rather than the kind of current system which is often focused on competition?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Fiona, one I could talk to all day, as you can imagine. So, I mean, I'll say something to begin with that for some is a little bit controversial, I suppose. I used the phrase a while back about education being an arms race for the affluent. And what I essentially meant by that is, you know, that the parents or, you know, families or communities of means will invest in the things that not just help people to get necessarily a traditional education that helps them to get on in life, but also helps them to build the social and cultural capital and the meta skills that I talk to, that creates, it helps them to you know, to find opportunities and to make the most of them. And I'm not sure that the education will ever not be an arms race, and therefore, you know, on some levels, is levelling up truly achievable if you know that the parents and families of means and, you know, of affluence are able to, you know, really invest in helping their kids to get ahead further. And I've yet to meet a parent that wouldn't want to be able to invest in their child's future. You know, it's a really normal or at least a very common parental trait. And I mean parents in the broader sense, parents, carers, anyone with responsibility for young people, or even, supporting people later on in the life. So when then I think about levelling up, I think, well, what will it take to achieve that? And so is it getting closer to this being a fair and equitable arms race? So do the extracurricular things that I subscribe to for my boys, for example, is it fair because I can afford to that I get to do that? Or actually should there be some sorts of means testing that means that everybody gets to go to the sports clubs, visit the museum, get involved with the scouts or whatever it might mean. And the reason I mention that in terms of that question is that we did hear, it was a real shame that Sir Kevin Collins felt he needed to resign from that levelling up position, because he talked about partnerships between civic society, educational institutions, the public sector and the private sector, and that being a way in which we can all invest in. And I do say young people quite regularly, but I mean anybody that needs that support at any stage in their life, to go through a high quality educational programme, to achieve whatever their objectives are. And often that is related to career and work. And it's a shame Sir Kevin walked away, because there were some really fine words, and I believe he meant them, and I believe he had a really good chance of delivering on that. But unfortunately, the fuel wasn't put in the tank to make that a reality. And whilst we've all got incredibly busy, pressured and stressful day jobs, partnerships are really hard, because they're being done on the side of people's desks, and people are so focused. I mean, David, I know, is a good example. I'm a good example. I speak to people all day in, day out, where finding the space to think about and work on developing true partnerships to do things with our collective intelligence and our collective resources that undoubtedly would make a massive difference is really difficult right now because of everything that's going on. So I think the government needs to find a way, possibly through whatever they do around levelling up, but more broadly, to facilitate brilliant partnerships, public sector, private sector, civic society, educational institutions, national stakeholders, regional stakeholders coming together with ultimately, the end users or the beneficiaries, as we think about them, to figure out, well, what are these problems? Which groups, which societies, which demographics have been most badly affected by just life in general, but then particularly the pandemic, and what might the solutions be that help them to at least have a chance in this arms race. And I know that's quite controversial for some people to think of it as an arms race, but the more you really look at the data and you analyse that, it to my mind, it really is. And that's right to the core of levelling up. How do you give people the opportunity and the means and the motivation? So I mean, the inspiration, the role models, the knowing that opportunity is for them to have agency in their own learning and their own life. Because that for me is what it's about. It's not about us, spoon feeding. It's about giving people agency throughout the learning and their career.
That's a great answer. I'm just looking at the questions in the chat, and please do everyone put some more in. There's a question here from Jacob Coburn about how we use education to create a growth mindset, so that the constant changes that we see and we experience are seen as a challenge to be addressed and tackled and worked through, rather than a barrier that stops you. And one of the things I see when I work on our adult participation in learning surveys, the most striking chart is that those who have been successful in their initial education, or those who have successfully taken part in adult learning, are the people that are going to carry on. You just need to get people started and have this sense that learning is something that has value and that they can do. And then the barriers to them taking up those opportunities are much reduced. I guess there's some real challenges for our initial education about how we create lifelong learners, but there's also things about re-engaging people if they've dropped out or had a poor experience in that initial education. Any of the panel thoughts about how we use education either in our initial stage or as young people or later on to try and create this growth mindset and get this culture whereby lifelong learning is just something that we do?
I mean, I'll have a go. I mean, I suspect any one of us could talk for hours on this. Two things I'll say, just to keep it fairly succinct. One is the education young people get up to the age of 16, I think, is really inappropriate. And if you look at outcomes, I think it's really obvious. Around about 60% of the cohort each year get a decent set of GCSEs. And in some ways, that group by and large go through to A-levels usually, possibly with a bit of tech alongside, and into university or higher education in college, and do fairly well. I mean, I think we could spend hours about, it's not perfect, but it's not terrible. But what's really terrible and really clear is that there are 40% who it hasn't worked for, and it's not because of them, it's because the system doesn't work for them. And I think we've just got to do more to change, particularly Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. I think we've got to bring in more of kind of technical skills, more exposure to different ways of learning and different types of skills that we can value. Because unless and until we do that, I think we just continually damage people's understanding of what learning is and why it's so rewarding. And I think that statistic about, you know, if you're a successful learner, you're a lifelong learner. If you, you know, and by about 21, if you're a successful learner, you just carry on forever. If you're an unsuccessful learner by 16, you just don't ever become a successful learner unless something really odd happens, you know. And I think we've got to change that fundamental. And I do believe it's about school not working for a very large minority, 35, 40%. I think the other thing that really, I think really important to say is all of the cuts that have happened in adult education in the last 10, 11 years, you know, the adult education budget sort of halving roughly, reinforces the competitive nature of the field. So David's point about it's an arms race. So what you end up with in places is instead of, you know, providers coming together to align what they do, to create pathways, to help learners progress, they actually fight over them rather than helping them find the next step in another organisation. And that joining up really kind of stops that first steps being delivered. Government keeps focusing on, at the moment, level 3, 4, 5 skills. They're really important, but what about someone who's got no digital skills or really poor literacy? That's not catered for enough because the funding cuts have hit that end of it far too much. And those early steps back into learning have almost disappeared in lots of places because the providers have been forced to do level 2, level 3, level 4, rather than kind of that social inclusion, that levelling up thing. So I think there's a fundamental shift that's needed in what we value as a society. Our last point, we value really, really annoyingly a degree higher than an ESOL or a literacy or a digital skills certificate. And I think we should reverse that. I mean, if I had one magic wand moment, I'd try and get everybody to think that getting that first digital skills or literacy or ESOL qualification was the most important thing we can get in this society. Because the people who end up with degrees are going to do fine, you know, and even without degrees, most of them would probably do fine. Those fundamental skills to participate in society are the ones that really transform people's lives and the people around them.
There's 2 points I've got to just to build on David's points, Fiona, if that's all right. So yeah. Really quick. So a recent study showed that 60% of educators' time is spent on planning and marking. So that means that at best, 40% of their time is spent on engaging, inspiring, enthusing, you know, understanding, and doing all the things that educators now have to do, which is so much more than just being a teacher, you know, to best support learners. So how do we create more time for educators to do what they came into this sector to do, to really inspire people to be the very best they can be, and then support them through great teaching, great learning? So that's the first thing. The second, and this is a little bit old now, but about 6 or 7 years ago, I did some work with a number of leadership groups across the sector. And it was some analysis that suggested up to 70% of their time was spent on compliance. And compliance it's really important, it matters, but if we're spending 70+% of all leadership bandwidth on compliance regimes, how are we going to, you know, create a growth mindset in the sector? Do you know, how can leaders inspire, motivate, enthuse their frontline workforce to be the best they can be, so they can give the very best to learners? We're obsessed with filling bids in and filling forms in and returning, and the last 18 months or so showed that the huge fragmentation and inefficiency that's there in this sector at a systems level, and the fact that even though we're highly bureaucratic, we don't even do the bureaucracy particularly well. And again, probably a bit controversial, but if we want a growth mindset, if we want to really truly inspire every learner that comes through the door, we've got to create more time and space to do it. And it bewilders me actually that in FE, we do it in spite of the system, not because you see so many really, truly inspirational stories of fantastic leaders, fantastic educators, learners who are truly inspired, and, you know, it makes a massive difference to their lives in spite of all of those things being in a way. Imagine if we could make that a bit lean and efficient and cut some of the bureaucracy and the admin. What could we do then? And that's the way that I think about the growth mindset piece.
Thank you. Erica, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, just building on David Hughes' point about, I mean, of course, there's sort of many facets of this, and intervention could be made a whole range of points. But I think the biggest point that we really need to focus on is that 40% where the under 16 education isn't working for them, and the system doesn't work for them. And we've created this system and, you know, decided that that's how we kind of measure things. But it's really quite arbitrary. And over the last sort of decade, we've seen this shift in that education towards more kind of academic, more rote learning, and push into the edges those more creative skills, more creative subjects. And I think that, as David said, that we really need to broaden that curriculum. We need to bring back those more creative subjects, because it's not just about learning those creative subjects. That also helps children to you know, think creatively and think improve their problem solving skills and that kind of thing, which is really essential for the world of work and, you know, adult life. I think we can all agree. But I think also in broadening that curriculum, it would enable young people to get a better idea of what the world is like, and what jobs are available to them. By narrowing that curriculum, it really kind of puts the blinkers on children, and they leave education. And for any that don't have that guidance through to college and university and want to take the path that perhaps is fairly well trodden already, it's like, well, what now? And that can be a really difficult time. So broadening that curriculum and showing young people what roles are available, whether it's technical roles, whether it's academic routes, and, you know, bringing in all of the different subjects, I think would be hugely valuable, and kind of we'd see really positive knock-on effects down the line.
Thank you, Erica. I'm really struck that whenever you have discussions with people in the FE sector, we're all very convinced of the difference that we can make to those big policy agendas, to levelling up or to other issues. And, you know, we've got some great evidence base, but it strikes me that we often fail to convince the Treasury, and that's why our budgets have kind of halved on, say, adult learning in the last decade. I'll start with you, David Hughes. Are we kidding ourselves that we can make this difference to wider social policy? And if we aren't, if it's really right, then what do we need to do to convince Treasury to invest in FE and skills?
Yeah, I mean, I'm convinced. I've seen it, and I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because sometimes I think you can become a cheerleader, and it's kind of passion for the institutions, but you know, and we've seen people's lives transformed by learning at all stages of life, and, you know, everyone can become a lifelong learner, and once they become a lifelong learner, they have that growth mindset, if you want to call it that allows them to face up to challenges differently, to adapt, to change, to be confident and stuff, and to share that with other people. So the problem with it is, I think it's difficult to codify that, you know, and I think I'm more optimistic now about Treasury, simply because they seem to be just starting to wean themselves off a kind of backing winners approach to economic development. So there's a chance, I don't think it's a very strong chance, but I'm willing to still be optimistic that they've recognised in the levelling up agenda that you can't just keep investing in the Southeast and London and people with high level skills in order to get the sort of society that we want as the electorate, you know. And some of the by-elections and the last general election showed that people are sending a different message, you know, and the polling that the Tories have seen says lots of the people who have voted for them, will vote for them, want more investment in technical skills and more investment to help people be successful locally, rather than the model we've had for the last 20 years is, you know, even kids coming from some of the most deprived places, getting into university, getting a good degree, they then go and get a job somewhere else. They don't go back because the jobs aren't there, you know. So I think this sort of idea that you've got to invest in places where actually you wouldn't do it on a simple cost benefit analysis, I think has shifted. And I think we can help with that, because we can take a community approach, we can take a local approach, colleges work on average with about 1,000 SMEs. It's not massive, but it's quite a lot, you know, and it's more than a lot of other organisations. And it's those SMEs that will drive the local economy principally. And it's those SMEs that need the help to be more successful. So I think we can do it. And I've seen in the discussions we've had with Treasury that they're shifting. The problem is when the deficit and the public, balance sheet doesn't look very healthy, they could just revert to type and just go, let's invest in London and the South East because it's easier. We'll win quickly. Whereas actually the long-term game is invest in the people and the places where it takes a bit longer, where it's not such an obvious kind of return on investment quickly. And actually you'll end up with a much better place to live in. The best societies in the world, in my view, are more equal, less unequal, and lots of benefits come from that. Less mental health problems, less health problems, much better productivity. So there's loads of evidence for it, and I think it is shifting.
Right. Erica, and given your role in IPPR North, you must spend a lot of your time thinking about levelling up, although recognising that levelling up is not just about the North. What do you think we need to do to both level up, but also to kind of ensure that skills and employment are seen as critical contributors to level up, and therefore where we need most investment, but also the right sort of policies?
I think that the role of the Metro Mayors there's a big role to play there, and as I said earlier, there's a huge opportunity that it's come to fruition, but we've not yet seen the sort of results of it because it only come in 2019 with this devolved responsibility for the adult education budget. Of course, there's a huge challenge because as that responsibility has been devolved, the budget has also decreased. So great, we've got the responsibility in the regions now, but not as much money to make a change with. But I think that one of the biggest potential roles of the Metro Mayor offices across the country is their convening power. And both Davids have alluded to it, that the power of partnership is really strong. It's also essential in order to make these changes, these policy changes, and bring them to fruition so that people actually see these changes. And I think that Metro Mayor's offices have that power to bring together employers, skills providers, but also bring that local knowledge and actually understand what communities, what the challenges are that communities are facing, and how to change that. So it's not just kind of focusing just on the economy and building the economy, but also, as David Gallagher pointed out earlier, those other skills, those skills of resilience, and preparing people to actually for the world of work. They can bring those sort of needs to the table, and hopefully be able to build something that's really strong and sustainable with those partnerships across those different organisations.
Thank you. In the chat, there's a kind of note there about the new Commission for In-Work Progression report, which is out today and which was mentioned earlier. And of course, those opportunities to learn and to train and to move into good and better work are really, really important. And employers have a key role to play as well. We've been talking quite a lot about public investment, but we also need to find ways of getting employers to recognise the value of training and development, and also to kind of financially invest in that. How do we do that when, you know, there are some brilliant employers out there, but also many who are going to rely on recruiting rather than training and developing skills? What can we do there so that good work also includes good investment in training and development of staff?
Well, the problem, I think, is that we have this idealised view of what employers are like, because, like you said, there are some really great employers that do invest in their people and who can see the return on investment really directly. But actually, there are quite a few employers who don't need to invest in their staff to do what they want to do, which is to carry on with a sort of low productivity, kind of low margin, making a profit, turning over, and being, in their views, successful. And we almost presume that what they should be doing is trying to improve their productivity and grow and get bigger. Well, lots of them actually don't want to do that, you know. So we just need to be a bit careful about this presumption that every business should be a high growth, high productivity, cutting edge, innovative business, you know. So I think some realism, I think, is important. And the vast majority of people work in SMEs, where they haven't got time to think about it, let alone do anything about it. So there's a sort of an in-work progression in an SME with 5 or 10 employees is meaningless, isn't it? You know, it doesn't happen. So I think that there's a proportionality here which is important. But I go back to my point that there are good examples of. So just take one. Dudley College, about 7 or 8 years ago, invested in a 3D printer, so that they could show the SMEs they work with what a 3D printer did, what its potential was. They brought them in to have a look at it, have a go, to prototype things, to see whether there was some application to their business. And then businesses started to go away going, actually, maybe we could use that. And a lot of them took on the 3D printer. They got the training from the college to be able to do it. It was a fantastic example of innovation that worked. And I think more of that type of very low level, what I'd call pedestrian innovation, not kind of sexy innovation, is really, really, really important. But we can't expect lots of SMEs to sort of pick up that report that's come out today and go, I'll tell you what, I'm going to be, you know, supporting progression in my workplace, because they're going, actually today I need to survive and tomorrow I need to survive. So, you know, so what you need is much more flexible training and education outside of work that's nothing to do with the employer. And we used to have that. It was called evening classes, and by and large they've disappeared, you know. So that tradition of people taking responsibility for themselves has been stopped by a decade of massive funding cuts that have hit adult education and FE colleges over the time. So there's something about just remembering what we used to do and bringing it back, as well as working with the larger employers to think about how they develop people rather than just recruit the people they need. Brexit has helped, and the pandemic has helped, because there's lots of employers really struggling to recruit, and they'll have to do some training, which is good.
Thanks, David. I don't think I've ever heard a sentence which starts "Brexit has helped" before, so that's a first for me. I think it's a really interesting point, isn't it? I think we're relatively unique in having a system where decisions to train are so based on individual firm decisions, and so if your employer doesn't train, or employers in your sector does, we're really stuck. And I know that lots of the reforms to skills to get employers more involved and put them in the driving seat, as they say, we're about getting skills that match what employers need. I mean, apart from the fact that I don't know whether you've ever met an employer that wants to be in the driving seat. I haven't, but it creates this massive gap that if employers choose not to do it, we don't have it. And so we haven't thought about place and sector and whole economy beyond that. And that's a real challenge, particularly when you have got things like Brexit and the pandemic, and investing in future skills rather than the things employers need. David Gallagher, from your kind of perspective, how do we get beyond that?
So I think about apprenticeships policy. I think it's an interesting lens through which to explore some of these challenges. And if I go back to apprenticeship reform, the introduction of the levy and standards and what have you, at that point in time, I was working very closely with literally hundreds of employers, thinking about their L&D strategies, their workforce development strategies and how apprenticeships could play a role. Because the levy came in and the pressure that put on businesses, apprenticeships almost became, do you know the analogy where if the only tool you've got to hammer, everything's a nail? Well, if the only tool you've got is an apprenticeship, well, everything's an apprenticeship. So I think it was a perfectly predictable, actually, and I did say it at the time in writing, so I can say that I did predict this, that employers would reduce their L&D budgets and turn everything into an apprenticeship. And because they all had leadership and management problems and project management problems and tech problems, that they'd probably spend it on level 4 and above for existing workforce. Completely, totally and utterly predictable. But I don't think many employers thought, we don't care about young people and we don't care about our future workforce and we don't care about equity and diversity and we don't care about, a sustainable approach to recruiting, retaining, developing talent. They just suddenly everything became a nail because they just had the hammer. And I think we do well to reflect back on what happened, why it happened, how in the next evolution of apprenticeships and associated things do we make sure that we put the incentives in the right place to make sure that we have really well considered, thoughtful and positive behaviour that enables employers, particularly the more ethical and the larger, who really will take this seriously, to play their role. And whilst David's absolutely right, we're an economy made up largely of SMEs, and therefore that won't. How can the bigger employers develop the approaches, the tools, even the resources working with us as a sector that can then hopefully be utilised elsewhere or can flow through supply chains? And what I mean by that is, why can't we have some flexibilities in levy to offer higher technical qualifications for, those leaders, those managers, those high level technical disciplines that enables then some of the budget to be freed up to take on that level 2 learner that wouldn't get into work other than through an apprenticeship. So I think we've just got to get and I mean incentives in the loose sense, the incentives put in the right place to be conducive of a really healthy and sustainable system where employers do their bit, we as a sector do our bit, and the government and its agencies do their bit to help a really healthy system. I spoke at a public sector event recently where lots of public sector employers, suddenly the penny dropped. If we use apprenticeships to take people from maybe level 3 to 4 or transition from a job role where we don't need as many people into another, as we do that, how do we create a vacancy? And how do we then make sure when we go out to market for that vacancy that we go out and look to proactively attract people that will give us a rich and diverse workforce that is representative of the communities they serve? And it just needs that, that broader, deeper thinking, rather than thinking, well, we need to reduce our L&D budget, we've now got a levy, bang, hit the nail. It just needs to be a bit more sophisticated, and we've all got a role to play in that. I do believe that particularly bigger employers are much more enlightened to that, and I do believe, and I know I'm an optimist, that most want to do the right things with this. They just need that support and guidance from us as a sector. The big challenge then, as David says, how do you get out to SMEs and smaller employers or employers who are just thinking about surviving and don't have the bandwidth to even sort of contemplate these things, never mind do them.
Thank you. One of the things I'm really mindful of when government comes up with a kind of slogan like levelling up, and it kind of then has to show how it's achieved it, and that can create opportunities if you can demonstrate, and if we can demonstrate as a sector the difference that we can make. So just mindful of time, I'd like to come around each of you in turn, and I guess I'm interested in thinking about the levelling up debate. What's the opportunity we think we could build on? What's the challenge we need to be wary of? And what's the one policy change you would like to see to make this happen? So, opportunity to build on, challenge to be wary of, and a policy change you'd like to see. Can I come to you, David Hughes?
Yeah, I mean, the thing to build on, I think, is that the skills white paper helpfully is about bringing things together around a labour market. So I've really strongly believed that you do need to kind of start planning at labour market wide level, which by definition includes a range of different colleges and other providers and other partners, Job Centre plus local authority, major employers, employer organisations as well. So that, I think the white paper is helping deliver that, and we've got to really grasp that opportunity. And it is called Skills for Jobs white paper. So we need to start thinking about what that means. The thing we need to be wary about is that it's not just about level 3 and 4 and 5 skills, it's about the whole system, and it's about the long term. So levelling up isn't just about getting more people to level 4, although that's really important. It's also about saying, where are the people who aren't participating at all? Where are the people with low literacy, numeracy, ESOL needs, and thinking about how that whole system works. And I don't think the government fully appreciates that bit. And I kind of go with, Erica thinking about, well, who is it that convenes it and pulls it together and makes it happen? Now, metro mayors, I think, can do that, but they don't cover the whole country. So what do you do if you're not in a metro mayor area is quite an important question. So the devolution stuff, I think, is really, really critical. And then my one policy change, I think that I keep coming back, because this is about employment and skills, around the universal credit issue. We need Job Centre Plus to be able to say to, Fred or Frida in front of them, well, actually, I think you need to do some training before you can get a decent job. Not, you need to keep applying for jobs until you get a decent job, because actually the latter doesn't work for lots of people. And I think the ability to have a nuanced system where people can, Job Centre Plus advisors can genuinely say, this is what I think you need, and it's skills training, and then to refer, and they can still draw down their universal credit, I think is really, really important.
Thank you, David. I knew you'd have an answer if I came to you first. Erica.
Thanks. I think in terms of the opportunity, I think the adult education budget, the devolution of responsibility there is, as I mentioned, keep banging this drum, it's a huge opportunity. David's right that metro mayors don't cover the whole country, but I think where the areas that they do cover, there's a huge opportunity to for metro mayors to take that responsibility and really make good use of it, use those convening powers, and also use their kind of influencing powers. Just going back to the previous point we were talking about what employers can do in Greater Manchester, that we've got the GM Good Employment Charter, which kind of pushes for decent work, and whilst we need to be pragmatic and practical, that not all SMEs can provide huge wealth of training, they should be looking after their employees, and so we shouldn't lower our standards or our expectations, and I think that the mayor's offices have that role to play. I think the challenge is that the flip side of that coin, that we get that devolved responsibility across the regions, but it comes with a smaller budget. So that's always going to be a challenge. We do need the resource in order to be able to, metro mayors need the resource in order to be able to effectively play their role. And I think that the change that I would like to see would be that it shouldn't just be about skills for jobs. It should be about skills for learning for the sake of it, for the love of learning, I suppose. It should be about yes, getting a good job, but also at the lower end of things, ensuring that you've got the skills to get through life, that you've got those digital skills to access what you need, and the sort of other end of things, that you can learn for the love of it, and all of the joy that can bring you.
Great. Thanks, Erica. And David, to you.
Thank you for giving me plenty of time there as well. Much appreciated. So three things for me. The opportunity, it does feel that the tertiary education system, FE, vocational and technical, has a voice at the moment, and we need to use it to best effect. And I think we've done as a sector well on that. I do worry alongside that it's at the expense of other things. For example, HE has obviously had a very hard time recently, and I don't think that's right necessarily. So I think that's the opportunity. We have a voice. How do we make best use of that ongoing? What I'm very wary of, that we think we've cracked it by creating, you know, a lifetime skills guarantee and the various other things and devolution, and this solves all of our problems. I'm really wary of the fact that, yes, we may be creating more and different opportunities, but to not radically shift things. And what I mean by that is, well, I mean lots of things. One of the things, we spoke to Microsoft globally recently. They said, we don't put people on long courses anymore. Everything is micro, you know, short, bite-sized, just in time, micro-credentialed when people need it, and constantly learning. Look at lifetime skills guarantee, big, chunky, time-consuming qualifications that take forever, that are quite old in a lot of instances, and that you've got to have debt to undertake. So that can't be right. One of us has got it wrong, one of us has got it right, and I'll not speculate as to who. So that's what I'm wary about. The change, I'm just going to echo what Eric has said. Can we just rename the white paper Skills for Fulfilling Lives, including meaningful work? Wouldn't that be so much better? Because it's not just about jobs. Do you know, that's not why I'm in this industry. Do you know, it's not why any of us are, I don't think. Meaningful work matters so much, but it is just one part of having a fulfilling life. And I just think we need to raise our sights on that. So that, for me, completely echoing Erica's points on the change that I'd love to see.
That's great, and a great note to end on. I'd really like this idea. I like the idea of a lifetime skills guarantee. I'd like it to be broader, so it's learning and skills, but for it also to be a real guarantee that you have the opportunity to learn and develop skills throughout life. That would be a great goal. I think what we currently have is a start, but certainly shouldn't be where we stop. And I think there's lots to be optimistic about and build on, but I think it's really important that we all come together, and we've talked about partnership to make sure that we make the most of what we have now. So thank you to each of the panelists. Thank you to participants for your questions, and thank you for joining the session.